Presbyterians. So we got a kind of long wind-up. We go through a number of things in Bible, church history, and then we're going to kind of narrow toward American Protestantism and Presbyterianism a little bit, and then we're going to try and talk about current circumstance in the light of that stuff. So, well,
that's why we're here.
yeah. Well, I think I will say one thing about this. I mean, in a reformed frame of reference, people can neither anticipate nor control all relevant outcomes, and that is true for communities as individuals and institutions. And so even the most powerful empires in the history of the world have not been able to anticipate or control all relevant outcomes, and that is in fact a source of hope for people on the other end of those empires, and it's something that people don't usually think about. So the limitations of human power are one of the things that are grounds for hope. There's a little more than that you can say, but without that you're in trouble, and that is true. So never be faked off base. The most powerful nations can, they can get surprised. The most powerful leaders can be surprised. That's all possible. Now how long that takes, how that goes, who knows, and we can say a couple other things about it. Human moral sensibilities don't entirely disappear all of a sudden, so they are always kind of compromised, right? So they never operate entirely adequately. And then there are opportunities presented in the course of history, again, that no one anticipates. So those, I think, are the grounds, basically, to hope. I could gin it up a little more than that and tell you that God always works out everything great and does it in short enough terms. I'm not going to say that. Okay, all right. So to review, there are a lot of political images and stances in the Bible itself. You can start with the Exodus, which is really the story of the release of slaves from Egypt and their constitution. And if you're looking for a positive portrait of the significance of a nation in the Bible, one place to go is simply the Exodus. I mean, people forget about that all the time. I think they should not. So really the constitution of Israel as a people or a nation under somewhat just laws rather than being slaves is the premier saving event in Hebrew scriptures. And that's an interesting enough thing. We talked about other things there too. You can talk about some of the prophets and what they want to say about the reign of God and its relationship to political orders. By political orders here, we always mean the polis before God, which is the whole life of the community or the political unit or the society. It doesn't simply mean electoral politics, and it doesn't only mean kings and princes. It may be that sometimes kings and princes would like you to believe that politics is only about them, but it isn't. And Aristotle knew that, and Bible knows that, and it's not too difficult to show. So there are all sorts of institutions that shape common life before God. Some of them are ones that are worked by elected officials. Many of them are not. For example, Little League Baseball, which I participated in as a kid, ordered the way I played baseball and a couple of my social relations and so forth. And the best I could tell, Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon had very little to do with that. So that's the way that goes sometimes. And really it's important that those things be relatively independent. Okay, so there are a lot of images in the Bible, including the prophets, Jesus' message of the kingdom. You want to keep your eye on, realize that the word kingdom is in fact a political metaphor, and it's intentionally that. And there were other metaphors that were available, they were not chosen. That's the one you've got. And what happens generally is a kind of special attention to and a number of things about justice and fairness with the widow, the orphan, the stranger within your gates. That's the ordinary list. Being a kind of a test of a society's justice. When you ask how the vulnerable are treated, the vulnerable cannot keep from being treated unfairly. So it's really just up now to the moral sensibilities of the society at hand. You don't really use narrowly the richest people, the most powerful people, treated unfairly, though they may be, but you don't use them as a class that way in the Bible on the supposition that they are more able to defend themselves in their own interests than the vulnerable. That's as simple as that. Okay, then we talked about, then we talked about stuff in the book of Revelation, and again, you can see that you have political images operating there. And you have the New Jerusalem come down from heaven, which is a city, though it's unlike other cities, but it is on earth, and it has a number of features. And one of the features is that the tree of life has leaves, and those are for the healing of the nations, which have all been defeated just before and pretty much destroyed, but then they return. And they can be healed in some sense. Now that means two things. It means there's something the matter with the nations. There's no point in healing things that are just hunky-dory. And the other thing is that they can be healed. Huh? Okay. So there are some images there that have political resonance. In terms of history of Christianity, we talked over some basic stances, and there's some variations on all of them. And so forth. One is to say that, well, Christian communities should construct an alternative polis. That is another society that you live in, because the societies on earth are impossible. They're too corrupt. There are things that you shouldn't really participate in. They're simply loci of temptation and bad things. And you've got that with Anthony the Great, who lives in a cave, leaves the village, stays there. All kinds of hagiographic little portraits of him. He lived to an old age, and they say he was in great shape for someone living in a cave. And people came and consulted him. He may have written at points to the emperor to claim that the emperor should rule with compassion and justice. That's a possibility. In any case, mostly what Anthony is for leaving the polis in the general polis, because it's hopeless. So you don't go. You keep your eyes on the prize, which in this case is completely eternity, and you try and be disciplined in this life. Now he becomes an important figure for monasticism as it develops in the West, which does not simply stick with the sorts of things that he says. But you do have, even for instance, in even in the early monastic orders and the way they're put together, the Benedictine order, you have a community that is sufficient to itself. It does have some relations to the wider polis, but it is in some respects an alternative polis. And in those communities, something that perhaps is not often pointed out, at least it's true with the Benedictine order, the brothers elect the abbot, and the abbot governs in consultation with the brothers. So there's a kind of proto-democratic thing there in a sense. There are, of course, laborers and other people on the monastic estate, which can be its own economic unit, etc. as well. So an alternative community is a possibility. Another possible way of going about it is the opposite. That is the virtual identification of Christian commitment with loyalty to the wider society and its government. And you see that with Eusebius early on. What happens with Eusebius is that Constantine becomes the first Christian emperor, and as long as you've got the first Christian emperor and he does a few things, then that's good, see? And that ends up being a good society. So that position has been taken up before. And so forth at different times, and that's Eusebius. And then you have a bunch of middle positions, right, which basically are that there is a kind of, you participate in the wider society, but you're critical somehow, and you affirm some things and not other things. And those positions are pretty varied, really, but Calvin and the Puritans is one of them. So the idea for Calvin in Geneva, a city-state, a free city-state that has broken away from the Holy Roman Empire and is now part of the Swiss League, the weak sister in that league, but nevertheless in it. Geneva is its own city-state. It has elected councils, something like the monasteries, but also very much like some of the Italian cities, Venice and so forth, that had done that earlier. And he wants to counsel that you participate in that, but you have certain standards. So the political community is supposed to mirror what he calls the perpetual rule of love, which I think, in his case, means works with a kind of social sensibility and solidarity with others, and it's supposed to care about what's good for the society and persons. And then also has a constitution, and the constitution, he says, needs to be based in a general sense of justice or equity, But the general sense of justice or equity is never enough to get a complete constitution, because a complete constitution needs to address particular circumstances and so forth. And you general notions of what's fair into the laws of the country. The example I like to use a lot is they will all claim that do not steal is a part of the general moral sensibilities. That is, you're supposed to have your own possessions, and those should be protected. But what counts as stealing in different societies can vary a little bit. And one thing you can point out is in our society we have laws against something called insider trading. But you really can't have those in ancient Israel because you don't have the financial markets to manipulate. So you see right there that without a great deal of tension between the general norm and what you're talking about in your constitution and your laws, the laws don't simply reduplicate a general sense of justice. They add, they're more specific. There's work that needs to be done there. When work is done there, the laws are never perfect, right? We're okay there. They don't perfectly reflect notions of justice and so forth, in part because people are all corrupt and they're likely to favor their own interests. Now, you do try and structure things so that those interests are mitigated. You anticipate, all right? Like pretend you're in the Ottati family and I'm the old man. See, you anticipate that he's not going to get your interests right all the time, right? And you anticipate that because even though you think he might be an okay guy, you've seen him in action before. He's a lot better on his own interests than he is on yours. And not only that, you've seen other people in action before, and they have a similar tendency. Huh? So you need to be there as a representative form of government. You need to check and balance powers. So those are some of the basic stances. Calvin wants to talk about stuff. He also writes something called the Ecclesiastical Ordinances of 1541, where he begins to detail the responsibilities of church and the civil councils, some of which overlap for things like hospitals, and the company of pastors visits there, but of course the city also maintains hospitals, and some of which are relatively distinct. Who's a member of the church, who gets to take communion, stuff like that. He wants the company of pastors and the church to decide that, and not the city councils, but he needs to try and make that clear. And then there are certain things that the councils work with that the church does not directly work with, such as civil cases and stuff. Yeah.
Maybe irrelevant, but I have no idea how big Geneva was at that time.
I don't think you're talking about more than around 10, 12,000 people, and that's probably a generous.
Everybody didn't know everybody.
Not everybody probably knows everybody, but there are 2,000 students on this campus. Most of them know each other. I'm trying to remember when a billion years ago, and there were 10,000 undergraduates. So there weren't too many faces that were a complete surprise after you're walking around a couple of years. I'll say that much for it. But yeah, probably don't all know each other quite. It is a city of that initially constituted German-speaking, with people who are artisans and have businesses. And Calvin and his group are French-speaking. They're refugees from France, and they're educated in humanist stuff, and they're running the church. So part of the tension that you have in Geneva is between the different language groups and their backgrounds and so forth. And that takes a long... Calvin is not made a citizen of Geneva until, I think it's 1559 or so, maybe 1560, and he's dead within a couple of years. So he'd been there for a while, and that was kind of an honor to make him a citizen, so he could then finally vote as part of the franchise, right? So not all males in Geneva are citizens who can vote, and they're the only ones who can vote. And it is a kind of commercial center. That's its guts, right? I mean, that's what it's done mostly. Loans, even though some people in the medieval period think that usury is terrible and you should never do it. He points out that biblically there is no absolute prohibition. and Israelites are not prohibited from charging interest in their dealings with other peoples who do charge interest. So it's not an absolute prohibition. And he wants to claim that in Geneva at the time there are some capital-intensive businesses, bookbinding and winemaking, and you need to collect some capital there. And when you collect capital there, you're not oppressing, quote, the sons of Geneva, but you are enabling them to be able to have jobs and do stuff. And this is very different than the perspective of the princes, I think, which I mentioned last time, who are essentially agrarian overlords and are not much interested in business in that sense. So easy for a prince to say that that usury, charging money of interest, is anathema. Harder to say that in Geneva, and he doesn't. Now, he does regulate it. It's got to have a ceiling of 10%, and you're not allowed to charge interest on loans to the poor, things like that. The time I read that, it was a long time ago, and I thought 10% was pretty high. But then there was the Carter administration where they went over 20%. Incidentally, you can read in newspapers now people with very short memories who will claim that recently the interest rates are the highest they've ever been. I know that's not true. I took out a loan on a house when they were higher than that. Okay. All right. So there goes a lot of American journalism. But anyway, so then this idea that the church and the civil councils will be somewhat distinct is something that Calvin is working on with the ecclesiastical ordinances. This is pressed further by the Puritans in this country. Roger Williams, in his arguments against John Cotton, for separation of church and state, as we sometimes call it. Really, it's for freedom of religion and faith. Cotton thinks that if you require a faith from government, it's not true faith. He is a separatist Puritan. He doesn't think that government and church should be coterminous or aligned necessarily. And he also thinks that the government is not competent to regulate true religion because everyone is a sinner, and so you don't give that kind of power to anyone in particular, including the magistrate or the governor. And that's Roger Williams for you. As I say, when you get to Rhode Island, you should always remember that. It's a nice little thing. All right, so then the Puritans in general have a kind of Republican bias with respect to government. They want to check and limit powers. They don't like kings. By and large, the reform movement is not too favorable with respect to a monarchy, and it wants something more representative that limits and checks powers. William Perkins, also an early Puritan, talks about calling and vocation. One of the very interesting things about it, from the perspective of what we're talking about, is the relationship between one's calling to be a Christian or Christian calling, which involves love of God and neighbor on a model of Jesus, something like that. That's a little quick as a summary, but I think it'd hold up. And what he calls particular callings, which are the specific responsibilities and roles that different people discharge. So we could say that I am a professor, one role in a particular kind of institution aimed at education and other sorts of things. I am a father, another role in a different institution called family. I'm supposed to care about nurture and care. I am a citizen, so I vote, and I'm supposed to care about general justice and general welfare. These are at least three roles, see? And they operate in different areas through different institutions, and they have somewhat distinguishable aims. Not only that, but the way that their practice differs. The practices that are appropriate in each need to be appropriate to the aims. So the appropriate practices of a father with children are not exactly the same as the practices of a professor with students, despite some of the protestations of some people in administrations occasionally. But that's not really true. I mean, they're not really your kids, and everyone knows that. And there's different things. Did I give my children tests at home and grade them on stuff? No, that's a step too far, right? I mean, that's going to fail as something to do. So don't do that. And this is true for a whole bunch of different roles that people occupy. So people have, a little bit of talent here. If they're operating in a society with multiple institutions, they know how to do more than one thing. And those things are somewhat differentiated, and it's important that they be differentiated. And so the educational institution doesn't tell me how to run my family, and my family cannot dominate how the educational institution is run. try Ottati College or there was such a thing. It was a high school in Rio de Janeiro. It was a little different matter. They're differentiated institutions with particular roles and aims, and these contribute to a complex public good. So when you talk about the public good, it's not just one monolithic thing. And you're not just asking one person to tell you what it is, you see. It involves things like families that care for children and raise them certain ways. It involves educational institutions operated. It involves physicians and so forth in medical practice who are supposed to be doing certain sorts of things. It involves civil government. It involves communications. It involves all this kind of stuff. And these all sort of somehow contribute to this thing called a public good that no one can completely define, see, in one sense, but it has those elements to it. Is the general idea if you're a Puritan, right? Because you're against one definition of the public good, which do things like chop kings' heads off. I mean, I'm not recommending that. I'm simply saying that it shows in the history they're not too pleased with that kind of way going about it. It can be when you take the self-guided tour, and I was on it once, and it's telling me that I'm standing in front of King so-and-so, I don't know which one, you know, and I look down, and I'm standing on the plaque for Cromwell, but is not even mentioned in the script, you know, he's, see you later, buddy. But okay, you can see the tensions in that kind of history. Reflections, which we want to talk about today on our way to a contemporary Virginia Episcopalian who went to school. See, I mean, this happens. They decide to go to Princeton. Princeton is the Presbyterian sort of deal up there, and so forth. Now, why he decides to go there rather than, say, William and Mary, this I don't really know enough about James Madison to tell you. There must be some reason. In any case, he ends up studying up there with John Witherspoon, who's Presbyterian theologian and Reformed character, and has certain ideas about public good and sin and things like that are kind of typically Calvinist and Puritan in a way, is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. These are Federalist Papers, which have contributions from a number of people, including Thomas Jefferson. Madison recognizes power to manage inordinate inclusion. Just individuals out there. There's persons and groups. There's Little League Baseball. There's like corporations, right? There's like lawyers groups. There's medical things. There's schools and so. It's not just like, you know, Fred and Susan. They are there too, but they are individuals. There are these institutions and these communities, and there are ethnic groups, you know, and they have interests, you see. and what this guy understands is that in order to kind of manage that, you have to have a little bit of juice, right? Otherwise, you just get run over. So it is not a society of completely benign, powerless communities. That's false, as we now know, right? Churches, oh boy. If you let churches just run wild, think about it. Roger Williams is not willing to do that. Okay. So you got Madison talking about that, and the reason that people, these persons and groups have inordinate inclinations is basically sinful corruption, which is universally distributed. And this is not late-breaking news. I mean, this is something you know is going to be the case, and so you try and structure things with that in mind. But on the other hand, delegating power to governing institutions also makes for problems. Why? Well, you give power to corrupted individuals and groups, and they're likely to keep going. Right? So you got a basic problem for government on your hands. You need to have some power to ride herd over these other things. If you want, you can think antitrust laws, but that's only one manifestation of that kind of thing. And on the other hand, you've got to be worried about giving power to the government to do it. Fun, huh? So you get a certain notion there. And the idea is that you can actually mitigate some difficulties and make some good moves this way but it's a little difficult. And, sometimes one step backward before you make two steps forward, to quote Chairman Mao, who's not much of a Democrat, but in any case, there you go. It's not so easy. Well, so then what you have here is you need to structure the government so that its several parts will be, quote, the means of keeping each other in their proper place. See, that's Madison. Yes, we're going to have different parts of the government, and then they're kind of butt up against each other a little bit, right? And that's good. That's intentional. Does that mean that sometimes government is less than optimally efficient? Yes. But Mussolini made the trains run on time. See, I mean, you can get it to run really, really smoothly. All you got to do is give all power to Il Duce, right? And maybe not that smoothly in the end either, particularly for him. But okay. So you have the means of keeping each other in their proper place. He then says ambition must be made to counter ambition. You see what he's doing here? He's got certain assumptions about what people are up to. And you need, quote, a policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. That's a wonderful little line. You need a policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests, by pitting them in this thing. You're going to supply the defect of better motives, which are not there. Okay? It's a pretty smart guy, really, And I don't want to sound bad here, but sure, for government, that's a big thing. But you can just think about the way families work, too. I mean, I don't want to make too much out of this, but once in a while, I would have to make a decision together with other people in my family about stuff like where are we going to work, where are we going to live, or something. And I did notice that they never let me alone make that decision. And there's a reason for that. And it's appropriate. I didn't really want to make it all by myself, but okay, even if I say that, I probably kind of push things a little bit a certain direction. At the Union Seminary, I was there for 30 years in a faculty meetings that make the things over here look like a piece of cake. We start at 4:30 and we'd be lucky if we're out of there by 7. And the faculty reviewed everything. I knew how the building and grounds were working, different students and their scholarships and were they nice people or not. I mean, your whole life passes before your eyes and you think, what am I doing here? But what you're doing there is you're one of 36 people who's reviewing everything. And if you don't show up, your lunch may be gone the next day. So you show up. And you know what else is really interesting? Every time I showed up, the rest of them were also there. Why do you suppose? See? You're going to supply. You're going to have supply by opposite and rival interests that are represented the defect of better motives. Smart guy. All right, so this leads him to propose separation of branches within government, which I suppose many of the people here will have learned. We're just jumping ahead here. Now we're in the 20th century. World War II is a very depressing phrase. World War I for the longest time was simply called the Great War or the World War. To call it World War I meant that it was followed by more. So World War II, that phrase, that's a real interesting thing. That's a tough way to go. Be a 3, right? I mean, okay, and so you've got that circumstance. Cold War, nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons aimed with IC. This is still the way that you keep a, quote, balance of terror, as it were, right? I mean, okay. And so he wants to say this. Persons and groups, including national communities, exercise vitalities and desires. They have creativity. They can do stuff. They're agents. But the vitalities and the desires that they exercise are both creative and destructive. Not only that, they are indeterminately expansive. You don't know where they don't know where they end. Okay? How much is enough? That's a nice question to ask people. They almost never can give you a complete answer to that sort of stuff. So they're indeterminately expansive. How much power is enough for a country? Okay? How much money is enough for an economy. How? Oh, well, let's not try and answer things that Reinhold Niebuhr thinks you can't. So they're both creative and destructive, and they're indeterminately expansive. Persons and communities, particularly persons, but to a degree also communities, can, he thinks, act on moral values and sensibilities. But sin is universal. And sin means a false centering on our own isolated interests, and in societies and groups, false claims to ultimacy or being like God or the divine. We put Genesis 11 in there because the wonderful story there is for the Tower of Babel at a city called Babel, which is Babylon, which is standing in as the first city and the first urban sort of culture. And the idea there is that they want to make a name for themselves and they would build the tower into the heavens, become like God. And Niebuhr thinks, of course, that that is a mythological story, but he thinks it's true. It's a true reflection of what human communities do. They always do that kind of stuff. When I was growing up and I was a kid, I didn't root for the Yankees. I rooted for the Milwaukee Braves because I just contrary out there up in New York. In 57, the Braves beat the Yankees. 58, didn't work out. But we grew up, and my brothers and I, there was a big building in New York, and we thought it was the Umpire State Building, see? Because baseball must have been what it was about. But it wasn't. It was the Empire State Building, and it was the tallest building in the world. And just think that over a little bit. What symbolically is involved in the intention of having those sorts of structures? I just blew it out there. And I'm not necessarily against the building, you know. Okay. So he's got this kind of idea. Government then needs power to restrain, guide, and sometimes guide indeterminate, often corrupted impulses of persons and groups. Antitrust laws, civil rights, and discrimination of dominant groups against minorities, stuff like that. And your government weighs in there. See, that's not just like let them rip out there. You know, who's going to get to play Little League Baseball? Little League Baseball needs to be run by the Little League, but on the other hand, shouldn't the have an opportunity to play Little League Baseball? Stuff. All right, or go to school or go to a college. All right, so the government needs that kind of power. On the other hand, as Madison said, concentrations of government power risk tyranny. So the balance between the two needs constant attention. This is just like a little problem that you're going to have again and again and again if you're trying to do things properly, according to him. Okay, so the loyalty of the kingdom of God, which is New Jerusalem comes down. It's a good place. There's no more tears. God dwells with God's people. You know, this is it. This is the fulfillment. Loyalty to the kingdom, which also, in fact, you see, upholds the interests of the poor and keeps you from trampling on the vulnerable and all those sorts of great things, which is, you know, it belongs to the poor, says Jesus in Luke 6, and all that sort of business. Loyalty to the kingdom infiltrates history with a picture that people have of what the world should be but isn't. So when you read the stuff about the New Jerusalem, it's kind of like what the world should be, but don't get too excited, okay? It's not here. My favorite city, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. No one in their right mind has ever mistaken Philadelphia for the kingdom of God. And I like the place. Great food, all that kind of stuff. I even like it that's a little gritty. You know? I like that better than Manhattan, which is beginning to look like a theme park to me. But okay, so loyalty to the kingdom of God infiltrates history with a picture of what the world should be but is not in persons. See that? It appeals to moral sensibilities of persons, and it undermines moral pretensions of communities and nations, especially the pretensions of power without justice. It just contrasts with the kingdom. Don't like it. Not good. Communities and nations may strive for justice, but sin and corruption are ubiquitous, and there is a perennial need for confession, self-criticism, a big thing for someone like Reinhold Niebuhr. See, like we need that. You got it from his point of view, and actually I agree with him. But the doctrine of sin is not something meant to make you feel terrible and just ruin your life. It's something to enable a realistic and truly humane participation in a world, you see. Because people who think that it's only the other guy who's full of it and's got a problem, they are some of the most dangerous people of all. It's very important for everybody in the religious community to say a regular prayer of confession and to use the word, if I may say so, sin. Don't sugarcoat this stuff. You don't want a bunch of communities to think they're morally superior. That's the last thing you want. I'm morally superior. Here we go. I can do anything. It's their problem. Sin is universal and ubiquitous. You structure. You ever see how Presbyterian churches, or the way they were structured? You got a session, you got ministers, you got this, you got this. It's intentional. It's structured that way because, like James Madison, the people who structured those things don't really think that the people in the Presbyterian churches are without sin. That's why if they did think people in Presbyterian churches without sin, they would participate in one of the grandest heresies of all time, called Donatism, which Augustine rejected a long time ago. Which keeps creeping back because it wants to think, I'm okay. All right. So anyway, so you got that stuff with Reinhold Niebuhr. Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch prime minister and theologian, he had an idea of society. It had different differentiated spheres. Government is one sort of sphere. Education is a sphere. Religion is a sphere. Each of these things have their own distinct institutions. The state is an institution. The university is an institution. The church is an institution. Each of these pursue distinct aims and ends. The state is supposed to pursue justice. The university, education and research and truth, and the church is supposed to cultivate piety and faith. God alone rules all the spheres. Right? The state is not God. The university is not God. And the church, please, is not God. Okay? That's the whole point. I mean, the whole point is you're supposed to be acknowledging something else. All right. So now, this is the general idea. So if one institution tries to dominate all the others, that's the same thing as trying to play God. And that is to incarnate idolatry. Okay? This is the idea. And so you want to disperse institutions in a society. They all pursue these different aims, and as they pursue these different aims, they exercise some power, the power to educate, the power to form children, the power to come up with just institutions, the power to communicate truth to people in a society. These are powers. See. All right. And so as an educational institution, according to Abraham Kuyper, the university should pursue unfettered inquiry after truth, fear from interference from the church or anything else, and he's a theologian saying that. And that's how it goes. This is what we call a dispersal of powers within a society more broadly. In each instance, then, a broad theology funds or gives a background for basic principles that illumine an appropriate ordering of life in the polis before God. That's what we're talking about. Life in the polis before God. We're now to the point where we got differentiated institutions with people with creativity and also corruptions participating in them, trying to somehow get along. So that's what we got. Some of the basic points out of this development are, first, God alone is God who rules over all. So God is God and we're not. I mean, it's a simple enough point, but you see, it's the point that no human being gets right in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, right? And they keep messing it up. And then second, people are good, distinctively capable, but limited creatures. We take the word creature. If you're a creature and you're made by a good creator, you're good. If you're a creature, you're limited. Human beings are distinctively capable, right? That probably in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, that largely means agriculture. But in any case, that's a real ability. It's the greatest technical achievement of the ancient world. Without it, you and I wouldn't be here. And it means that you have to be able to classify different plants and their kinds with their seeds, and you have to be able to classify the different animals and name them. And if you can do that, that's genuine power. But so that is a distinctive capability, and there are more capabilities that and good, but also limited. No person can anticipate or control irrelevant outcomes. No community can, etc. like that. Persons never have the powers that are traditionally ascribed to God. Persons and communities are not all sovereign. And in fact, when you get to something like the book of Revelation and they refer to Rome as Babylon, you see, it's a great one because Babylon is no longer by that point and is in the rearview mirror, and Rome is claiming to be the eternal city. So if you say, you're saying one day they could be old news, right? Not the eternals. It's great stuff. In any case, you've got that going on there. And people are good, distinctively capable, limited creatures with moral sensibilities. They can accomplish much in society and so forth, technically in other ways, but they cannot neither anticipate nor control irrelevant outcomes. Persons, communities, and institutions are beset by perennial corruption. They're sinners, universal corruption, and they are prone to elevate themselves in their partial interests, and that's always true, see? In different ways. Doesn't mean everyone does it the same way, and it doesn't mean you can't have preferences among different ways people might do it, but it does mean that you can expect it, huh? We could believe that there's such a thing as a completely benevolent empire. Hey, come on. No one thinks that's true of Rome, and I don't think anyone thinks that's true of the American imperial interests either, and it wouldn't be true of any other one. This does not mean that you should eliminate all empires. I don't know where the history is that eliminates all that, incidentally. You know, I mean, a nice idea, peace, love, and orange juice or something, world order and no empires. So where? I mean, but okay. So you might have to distinguish between better and worse empires. Then we leave that one alone, but we'll just see how it goes, depending on how you define empire. I mean, you know, you don't have to occupy. You might do it with economic interests, a variety of things. You might do it with rock and roll, really, with all kinds of mass communications, a lot of possibilities. Not going to worry about it now. But the idea then is that they're beset persons and communities by perennial corruption. They are prone to elevate themselves interest, to make those seem universal and completely fair. Okay? Like Babel. Then history under God presents opportunities to restrain evil and pursue good, which, if we recognize them, we do have some partial moral sensibilities that can operate, and may be pursued, particularly if you know how to pit different interests against each other a little bit to anticipate it. And you can pursue these things, and that even if you do, everything falls short of the kingdom of God, right? You never get the kingdom of God. Okay. At least you don't get it in Davidson or in Philadelphia or something. Oh, you never know. It could come down there. Savonarola thought it was going to come down in Florence. But it turns out a lot of these characters usually think the kingdom of God is coming down at their house, you know? And there we go. Some implications for life in the polis before God. There are indeterminate human possibilities for creativity, good, and destructive corruption. You need social spaces where they can exercise capabilities, but you also need restraints. They tend to favor structures that allow for and nurture the exercise of these capabilities, as well as structures that disperse powers, check, and balance. And it turns out some of the same structures can do both, you see. So that if Little League Baseball is not dominated, if Dwight Eisenhower does not determine how Little League Baseball goes, and he had no interest in doing so, then you got a little freedom there to learn how to play ball, right? And so you have a space, and you exercise power to teach kids a little bit how to get along and play baseball. Okay, it's not everything, but not nothing. And you have a space to do stuff, and then at the same time you can ask how you restrain those spaces or guide those spaces a little bit. Who's going to play, who's allowed to play, stuff like that. Okay, so you want to have structures that allow for the nurture and exercise of capabilities, and they also disperse. Because meanwhile, while Little League Baseball is teaching kids how to play ball, Dwight Eisenhower can't touch that. He doesn't get to tell you how to play shortstop. And I can tell you right now, if you're a little kid in New Jersey and you're around 12 years old, you're a lot more concerned about how to play shortstop than you are what this guy's doing. interesting enough. He doesn't want to teach you how to play, but the point is, he doesn't. So there's a certain power involved there. How are you a teammate with other people? Well, it turns out that you wear green hats and play for JD Construction with Mr. Murigliano coaching the thing and stuff, and that's where you're learning that first. I don't want to tell anyone anything they don't already know. Don't learn it first from Congress people. You learn it first from your Little League coach, man. Okay. And, there are limitations to this sort of thing, but there's power. So society then is a collection of differentiated institutions, the state, colleges and universities, media, that exercise powers to pursue distinctive aims, justice, inquiry and education, communication. No one institution should determine all the others. An order which would usurp God's sovereignty and be idolatrous and be the picture book definition, Reformed theological terms, of a misplaced totalitarianism, which would mean one institution determining the totality of spheres and institutions in a society. Not what you're supposed to do. The reason why Puritans disliked kings a little bit. So next time, what I want to do, and we can talk about it some now too, is I'm going to talk about social and moral crises and the relevance of theological visions for them. How come they become relevant even in pluralist societies at certain points? And then we'll use John Lewis as an illustration with the continuing crisis of racial justice in America, because he's pretty explicit about how his theology works with that. And of course, he is also a congressperson. He's a public figure, and he's doing it in a relatively contemporary environment where not everyone is a Christian, but nevertheless, he's got a theology. It's kind of interesting to see how that goes. And then ask about the current American crisis in the perspective of a Reformed theological vision, basic moral principles and structures. So it's going to turn out that I think the crisis of racial justice in America continues. It's not over by any stretch of the imagination. The one you have right now is a little different than that. And you can have more than one crisis at a time, have fun, and figure out how the theological visions interact with them. That's what we'll try and do. So we can just stop there, and I'll try and answer questions if I know how to do it. I may not know. We'll say that we are heirs to a very significant heritage here. And we're not the only game in town, and there are other people who have other heritages and see things differently, but there's no reason all of a sudden for you to stop talking about the insights of your own heritage. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So is that bad, and is it increasing?
So we want to say relatively independent, obviously not completely separated, right? And then the other thing is, one question is how to order them internally. So the question here is, what about these different institutions and the way they relate to one another and so forth? Let's take something like the college over here in the Presbyterian Church, right, which is not the only illustration of this sort of thing. Presbyterian Church USA has ordinarily maintained educational institutions with their own charters and an independent, self-perpetuating board of trustees. So the Presbyterian Church USA has not ordinarily shown up at a college and said, here's your charter, here's your board, here's your curriculum. There are times during fundamentalist modernist controversies that run into certain things, but usually not that far, and it does it in different ways at different places. And so one of the things is there can be an effort on the part of churches to sponsor educational institutions, to care about the education of the whole person without simply determining that stuff. And the faculty then should have immediate responsibility for curriculum and independence to do so. The charter should be independent. self-perpetuating board of trustees. Does this guarantee that you're going to end up with a wonderful institution? Of course not. Let us not fool ourselves. But it does at least mean that the PCUSA isn't going to be sitting around in committees trying to tell you what to teach. It's not happening. So there is to structure them. Again, I think with respect to government stuff and education, this is a very big deal, right? I mean, one thing that's true is that a lot of educational institutions receive a lot of government money and grants for research and other things, and they become dependent on that money. Now, is it a bad thing that the government fund grants for institutions' education? It's a nice discussion to have. To what extent degree does the government have interest in certain forms of research being pursued at institutions, and what sorts of forms of research, and how does it work out? You can talk about everything from military applications to public health applications to other sorts of things of that research. And some people are going to claim that the government does have an interest in that, at least much of the time. And you've had a certain growth in that kind of stuff in this country, so you're at the point where a lot of larger universities are highly, highly beholden to government grants and so forth. You know, okay, so this does represent a kind of a problem, I think, in educational terms, and the problem it represents is there's no such thing as funding without strings attached. Now, the strings can vary, depends who's got them and so forth, but if you get your money from someplace, then you're somewhat beholden on them. So places can have private donors, and private donors can pull out because they don't like how many non-Christians you're going to have on your board of trustees, which is what happened with the Belk stuff over here some years ago. Or they can support you because they think that it's great that you have this sort of pluralist stuff, the Duke Foundation, or I mean, all that kind of stuff's possible, right? And I don't know what to say about how to set this up, but I will say this much, that pluralizing the funding sources of an institution to the extent you're able to do so is one of your best hedges against simply collapsing them. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do. Take the University of Pennsylvania, where I went to school. I mean, their hospitals and clinics are larger than some cities. So, and there's a lot of money involved in that. And so this is a major problem. It could be the case, you know, who knows? It could be the case that some smaller colleges that aren't as dependent on that stuff, see, and have pluralized funding, maybe you could trust, under certain circumstances, you might trust them a little better to retain a modicum of independence or not, depending on how they go. And of course, they're very varied. And take the Presbyterian colleges, Grove City College is a Presbyterian college, and it's got some relatively explicit ideological commitments that are not reduplicated here, and so forth. And there's some other things like that. So you can't tell how it's going to turn out, but I think you want to keep it. Well, I think you want to keep it from simply merging. And on the other hand, you've got these problems. And look at the practical problems on funding and what you're going to do, and then you have different sorts of institutions. I do think that the current environment promises a kind of renewed relevance for a somewhat smaller college that has diverse patterns of funding and can go its own way at least part of the time. And that looks to me like a feature of the circumstance. And I don't mean to say that it's at all points superior. I mean, look, I thought I got a really nice education in Philadelphia there, and it was a diverse place, a good place to go. But you see how much money they depend on there. They don't all of a sudden want to cut loose all that medical stuff. Nor should they, I think, but okay. Yeah. A little bit of a problem, really. Now, it turns out that a lot of Little League Baseball doesn't have as big grants. And it can be infiltrated and so forth. But I think those things work a certain way. Families. Now, you've got the same problem, I think, right now with law firms and stuff like that. How does this work, you know, exactly? How do you maintain some independence, a relative independence? And it's not difficult to do. The leadership it is difficult. The leadership of these places is put in a difficult spot, right?
When I was a kid, the Little League divorced itself from the Little League.
Mm-hmm.
They knew their kids were never going to get into Williamsport.
Well, yeah.
Let them all play.
Right.
And the Little League rules were ridiculous.
Okay, so they do something else.
They just said, I'm on,
I think that's great.
that was allowed. There are a lot of places where you say, I'm on my own, and they say, no, 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 no.
Right, right.
Everybody is in the barrel.
You could do that. And I think
They really can't do it.
and what I like about the illustration, see, there is a certain kind of power being exercised there. One needs to understand that. And it, okay, that's not as much power maybe as, like, I don't know, Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago or something as a law firm. But it is power, right? And it depends on having a space to do it a little bit, right? Same thing with art centers and, and all that kind of stuff. If you put on a number of artistic productions and they're public and they represent a cultural heritage, there is a certain amount of power involved in that, right? At all levels. I mean, no matter who's doing the selecting. And so the way to do this is not to have, you don't want every place making the same selection, and very often they don't make the same selections, and there you go. But there are a lot of different ways in which that variety can get reduced, and you want to be a little careful about it, I think. But if you're asking about why cultural productions in the arts should not simply be the purview of the state, doesn't mean that all the art will turn out to be crummy if you do that. I mean, there's some old Soviet things that people think have some virtues, but you do see the problem there, and got that. And the same thing for educational institutions, all that sort of stuff, really, right? And then communications. I mean, look, I don't tell you anything, but if communications are not at all relatively independent in some ways because they're hooked up with different funding sources or something like that, you could have a little bit of a problem on your hands with trying to communicate truth, which no one's ever really going to agree on entirely. And probably, again, if you pluralize it, you're in better shape than if you try and make it monolithic. But that would at least be what this tradition is going to worry about. Now, it could be wrong for all of that, but if you're a good old Calvinist coming into the contemporary environment, these are some of the questions that are going to be on your mind. Right?
One
Yeah.
thing you haven't mentioned, you don't need to, is the temporality of what decision making is all about.
Yeah, the temporality, and I think the question is about the temporality of decision making. I'm repeating that because apparently if you project this, people need that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to go through all this. History is long and it's short, right? I mean, let's talk about how short it can be. Justice delayed is justice denied. You delay something for 20 years, and there goes a generation and a half, and they never recover from it. Well, that's okay, so it's short. But history is long, like people make decisions, and they're not in stone, and it's not. And even if they are in stone, they don't remain as they were for a long period of time. I've read some things. I don't know how much credence to put to these things, but about stuff like, what would have happened if Germany won the Second World War? And what would things be like in North America? I mean, these are highly speculative little things. I don't. I'm glad it's not my field to speculate that dramatically, and even as a theologian. But I guess the interesting thing about some of those things is the claim that after about 40 years or so, probably wouldn't be that much difference, because who's going to have enough power to determine what goes on in all these continents and stuff like that? And it's interesting. So maybe with World War II, maybe you're playing for 40 years. I don't know the answer to this. But even if you're only playing for 40 years, and I'm not sure that's true, well, that's a few generations. Justice delayed, justice denied. How many concentration camps through all that? I mean, it doesn't it doesn't eliminate the importance, but the point really well taken. Decisions made today are not necessarily permanent, and people can claim whatever they want. They can claim they were the eternal city. It doesn't matter. We don't believe it. Now, does that mean we know that it's got one foot on a banana peel and things are okay? Maybe not. Right?
I wanted to circle back to the young lady who brought that up in the beginning.
Yeah.
And Peter's going to preach on that a little bit.
There you go. So next time, what we're going to do is a look at John Lewis and continuing crisis of racial justice, and then I'll try and talk about current crisis and the way that a Reformed theological vision intersects. I think you can say already out of what we talked about here. And then we're just going to ask a little bit about the sort of questions that come up in those respects. And we'll realize that we're working with one particular kind of theological voice among others. I'm willing to defend it among other theological voices, at least to a significant degree. And then I think there are other voices besides that are not theological. And, you know, everyone's welcome to their own voice here. But if you're welcome to your own voice, then it's okay to use your own voice and say what's there. Right? Okay. And you don't have to back down. I mean, look, this is Reformed tradition land here. No one gets to reset all of this stuff. That's that. And so we say, the Martin Luther's hymn, the body they may kill, God's truth abideth still, his kingdom is forever. See, you know, you don't have to cave on stuff necessarily. It's not comfortable, but you don't have to. All right, well, see you next week.